Marcus Chen stood at the corner of Riverside Drive, staring at the house he'd left 15 years ago. The white colonial stood exactly as he remembered it, perhaps a bit more weathered, the shutters now a faded blue instead of navy, but unmistakably home. His hand instinctively moved to smooth down his deliberately rumpled thrift store jacket, and he caught himself checking his reflection in a parked car's window. Good. He looked exactly like what he was pretending to be, a man who'd lost everything. The truth was considerably different. Marcus had spent the last 15 years building a tech empire in Silicon Valley. His facial recognition software company had sold to a major corporation for $847 million just 3 months ago. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily wealthy. But standing here now, dressed in worn jeans and scuffed shoes, carrying a battered duffel bag he'd bought specifically for this charade, no one would suspect it. He'd told no one about his success. Not his mother, not his younger sister Maya, and certainly not his older brother Derek. When he'd left Chicago at 23, he'd been broke, desperate, and drowning in debt from his father's failed restaurant. His family had needed him to stay and help, but he'd chosen his dreams instead. The guilt had eaten at him for years, even as his bank account grew exponentially. Now he was back, ostensibly broke and beaten by life, to see what they'd become without him. More importantly, to see how they'd treat him now that he had nothing to offer. Marcus took a deep breath and walked up the cracked driveway. The doorbell's chime echoed the same 3 notes it always had. Footsteps approached, and then the door swung open to reveal his mother, Ann Chen. She'd aged, her hair now completely silver, deeper lines around her eyes, but her expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and shock in rapid succession. Marcus. Her voice was barely a whisper. Hi, Mom. She pulled him into a fierce embrace, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. This part wasn't pretend. He'd genuinely missed her. Where have you been? 15 years, Marcus. 15 years without a word. She pulled back, gripping his shoulders, her eyes searching his face. Then her gaze dropped to his clothes, the cheap duffel bag, and her expression shifted to concern. What happened to you? It's a long story, Marcus said, delivering the lines he'd rehearsed. Can I come in? Anne stepped back immediately, ushering him inside. The house smelled like ginger and garlic, someone was cooking. The living room looked smaller than he remembered, the furniture the same floral patterned pieces from his childhood, now faded and worn. Family photos lined the mantel, and Marcus noticed his own high school graduation picture was still there, though it had been moved to the back. Maya. Derek. Anne called out. Come here, quickly. Maya appeared first from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was 28 now, no longer the gangly teenager he'd left behind. She froze when she saw him, her face going through the same emotional journey as their mother's. Marcus. She approached slowly, as if he might be a ghost. Is it really you? It's me. She hugged him, but he felt her hesitation, her questions held back by surprise. Derek emerged from upstairs a moment later, and the warmth immediately drained from the room. Well, Derek said, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. The prodigal son returns. At 42, Derek had their father's build and his permanent scowl. What's it been? 15 years. Must be doing pretty well for yourself to just drop by. Marcus noted the sarcasm, the bitterness that had clearly fermented over the years. Actually, Marcus said, setting down his bag, I'm not doing well at all. My business in California failed. I lost everything. I've been living in my car for the past 2 months, and I couldn't think of anywhere else to go. The silence that followed was deafening. Anne's hand flew to her mouth. Maya's eyes widened with concern. Derek's expression, however, remained skeptical, his arms crossed over his chest. Living in your car, Derek repeated flatly. And you decided to come back here after 15 years of nothing. No calls, no letters, no, hey, just checking if Mom's still alive. Derek, Anne snapped. That's enough. He's your brother, and he's home. He stopped being my brother when he left us to deal with Dad's mess alone, Derek shot back. Do you have any idea what the last 15 years have been like? The creditors, the lawsuits, I said enough. Anne's voice carried an authority Marcus remembered from childhood. Marcus, you must be hungry. Come to the kitchen. Maya's making dinner. Marcus followed his mother and sister, acutely aware of Derek's hostile stare burning into his back. The kitchen was warm and cluttered, a large pot of something savory bubbling on the stove. Maya stirred it nervously, stealing glances at him. I'm making congee, she said softly. Comfort food, I guess that's appropriate now. Sit Sit, Anne insisted, pulling out a chair. Tell us what happened. Marcus had prepared this story carefully, weaving just enough detail to make it believable. He told them about his tech startup, how promising it had seemed, how he'd invested everything he had. He described the investors who'd pulled out, the competitor who'd stolen his idea, the slow collapse of everything he'd built. He made himself vulnerable, defeated, small. Anne listened with growing distress, her hand occasionally reaching out to pat his. Maya's eyes shimmered with tears. Even Derek, leaning against the doorframe, seemed to soften slightly, though his expression remained guarded. So you're completely broke? Maya asked quietly. Marcus nodded. I have about $300 to my name. I drove here on fumes and prayers. I know I have no right to ask, after everything, but I was hoping, maybe I could stay here for a few weeks. Just until I get my feet under me, find a job, any job. He watched their faces carefully. This was the test. Would they turn him away? Resent him? Take advantage of his supposed vulnerability? Anne answered immediately. Of course you can stay. This is your home, Marcus. It will always be your home. Mom, we need to talk about this, Derek interjected. We're barely making ends meet ourselves. Maya's working 2 jobs, I'm pulling double shifts at the plant, and you're still doing alterations for pocket change. We don't have room for. We'll make room, Anne said firmly. Your old room is being used for storage, but we'll clear it out. Maya, you can help me after dinner, yes? Maya nodded immediately. Of course, Mom. Derek pushed off from the doorframe, his jaw tight. Fine, whatever, but I'm not loaning him money, and he better start pulling his weight around here. He left the kitchen, his heavy footsteps echoing up the stairs. Marcus felt a genuine pang of guilt. Derek's anger was justified, even if he didn't know the full truth. Marcus had abandoned them, regardless of his reasons. That night, lying on a bare mattress in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes of old clothes and broken appliances, Marcus questioned his plan for the first time. He'd expected some coldness, maybe outright rejection. Instead, his mother had welcomed him immediately, despite their obvious financial struggles. Maya had hugged him goodnight, whispering, I'm glad you're home, even if the circumstances suck. Only Derek remained hostile, but even that felt more like hurt than cruelty. Over the following days, Marcus began to understand the reality of his family's situation. It was worse than he'd imagined. The restaurant debt had devastated them. Derek worked at a manufacturing plant 60 hours a week, his body already showing the wear of hard labor. Maya juggled shifts at a coffee shop and a grocery store, studying for her nursing certification in whatever spare moments she found. Anne took in sewing at all hours, her fingers often bandaged from needle pricks, her eyes strained from close work. Yet they shared what little they had with him. Anne insisted he take portions from every meal, even when he saw her own plate was smaller. Maya bought him a new toothbrush and deodorant with her tips, waving off his protests. Even Derek, grudgingly, gave him an old coat when the weather turned cold, muttering that he couldn't have his brother freezing to death and giving the family a bad name. Marcus found work at a local warehouse, deliberately taking a minimum wage position he was vastly overqualified for. He contributed to groceries, but not too much, that would break character. He helped with chores, fixed things around the house, and slowly began to reintegrate into the family's rhythm. 3 weeks in, he came home from his shift to find Maya crying at the kitchen table, bills spread before her. What's wrong? He asked, sitting across from her. She wiped her eyes quickly. Nothing. It's stupid, Maya, she sighed, gesturing at the papers. The nursing exam. I finally saved enough to register, but Mom's medicine went up in price, and Derek's car needs new brakes, and I just... She laughed bitterly. The exam is in 6 weeks. By the time I save up again, I'll have to wait another 6 months for the next testing date. I'm so tired of waiting, Marcus. I'm so tired of everything being just out of reach. Marcus's heart shattered. His sister was brilliant, dedicated, and she was drowning in the poverty he could erase with a single phone call. The test she couldn't afford cost $200. He had $847 million in various accounts. How much do you need? He asked. $200, she said, then quickly added, but I'm not asking you for it. God, you're in a worse position than any of us. I'm just venting. I'm sorry. Marcus made a decision in that moment. He went to his room and retrieved the envelope he'd been keeping hidden, his emergency money, supposedly. It contained $1,000 in cash. He brought it back to the kitchen and placed $200 on the table. Take it, he said. For your exam. Maya stared at the money like it was a snake. Marcus, no, that's your emergency fund. What if something happens to you? You're something that's happening to me, he said. You're my little sister, and you're going to be an incredible nurse, and I'm not letting $200 stand in your way. Take it. She started crying again, but this time she stood and hugged him fiercely. I'll pay you back, I swear. I know you will. He didn't tell her he didn't need it. Didn't tell her that $200 was less than what he'd spent on coffee in a typical month in Silicon Valley. He just held his sister and felt, for the first time in 15 years, like he might actually deserve to be called her brother. A month into his stay, Marcus was helping Derek replace the brake pads on his ancient Honda when his brother finally spoke about something other than the task at hand. You're not what I expected, Derek said, not looking up from the wheel well. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who'd gotten soft, maybe. Someone who'd come crawling back expecting us to fix everything for him. Derek sat back on his heels, wiping grease from his hands. But you've been working hard. Contributing. Not complaining, even though I know this isn't what you wanted from life. Marcus chose his words carefully. I'm grateful you let me stay. All of you. I know I don't deserve it. Derek was quiet for a long moment. Dad's debt wasn't your responsibility, he finally said. I blamed you for leaving, but I get it now. You were drowning too. We all were. Maybe you got out while you still could. I should have called, Marcus said. Stayed in touch somehow. Yeah, Derek agreed. You should have, but you're here now, and that counts for something. He extended a greasy hand. Clean slate. Marcus shook it, feeling emotion tight in his throat. Clean slate. That evening, the four of them had dinner together for the first time since Marcus's return. Anne made dumplings, his favorite, and they talked and laughed like the years hadn't created a chasm between them. Marcus watched his family and saw their resilience, their generosity despite hardship, their capacity to forgive. He'd come home to test them, to see if their love was conditional on his success. Instead, they'd tested him, revealing how shallow his premise had been. They'd shown him what family really meant, not the absence of disappointment or anger, but the presence of grace and second chances. They'd welcomed him with nothing because that's what family does. They'd shared their small portions because that's what love looks like. Marcus excused himself after dinner, claiming exhaustion. In his room, he sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled out his phone, the expensive encrypted one he'd kept hidden, not the cheap burner he used for his warehouse job. He made several calls, sent several emails, and set certain wheels in motion. The charade would end soon. But not with a dramatic revelation. He'd done enough of taking. It was time to give, and to do it right. Over the next week, things began to happen. The restaurant debt, which had haunted them for 15 years, was suddenly settled by an anonymous benefactor working through a law firm. Derek's plant received an investment from a new tech company looking to modernize, with Derek specifically recommended for a management training program. Maya received a scholarship for healthcare workers that covered not just her exam but also her future tuition. Anne found a mysterious check for $50,000 in the mail, payment for consulting work she didn't remember doing, with a note explaining it was legitimate income she could claim on taxes. Marcus watched their confusion and joy from the sidelines, saying nothing. On his final evening, before his real identity would inevitably be discovered, Marcus gathered his family in the living room. I have something to tell you all, he began. And for the first time in 2 months, he told them the truth. The truth about his success. About the sale of his company. About the test he'd devised and his arrogance and shame. About how completely they'd shattered his assumptions. About how they'd taught him that he'd been measuring worth all wrong, that being rich meant nothing if you were poor in character, and that his family, struggling and stretched thin, were the wealthiest people he'd ever known. Anne cried. Maya looked shocked. Derek stood up, and Marcus braced himself. Then his brother laughed. It started as a chuckle and grew into a full belly laugh. You're telling me, Derek said between laughs, that you're a multimillionaire, and I made you replace my brake pads. I needed to know if you'd still love me with nothing, Marcus said quietly. Derek's laughter faded. He walked over and pulled Marcus into a rough embrace. You idiot, we never stopped loving you. We were angry, yeah, hurt, but you're our brother, that doesn't have conditions attached. You could have just asked, Maya added, smiling through tears. Saved yourself 2 months of warehouse work. No, Anne said softly, and they all turned to her. He couldn't have. Sometimes we need to walk through the valley to understand the mountain. Sometimes we need to receive to learn how to give. She looked at Marcus, her eyes ancient with wisdom and bright with love. And sometimes we need to pretend to have nothing to discover we already had everything. Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. So what now? Derek asked. You going back to California? Marcus looked around at the faded furniture, the worn carpet, the cramped house that had somehow become sacred ground. He thought about his penthouse in San Francisco, currently sitting empty, and about the life he'd built alone. Actually, he said, I was thinking about moving back to Chicago. Starting fresh, and I have some ideas about how we could open a restaurant together. If you're interested, a real family business this time, done right. Maya grinned. Does this mean we're all rich now? It means, Marcus said, that we're all family now. Everything else is just details. And in that moment, sitting in that humble living room with his mother, brother, and sister, Marcus Chen finally understood what it meant to be wealthy. It had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account, and everything to do with the people who'd welcomed him home when he had nothing but a lie and a duffel bag. He'd come to test them, but they'd transformed him instead. And that, Marcus realized, was the greatest fortune of all.